Hey, crew, it's Pitt, and let's get that clear pull in, huh? Hey, crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Freud, not some more. Wow. Okay, I'm back with some more somnambulism. Today we're diving back into the works of Carl Jung. I don't know, must have been a Freudian slip. We will be reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the box down below so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. Also, linked will be the original source material so that you can get a better look and make sure that I am telling you the truth. Uh, if you find value in what we do, I ask that you do all the wonderful things down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that is stated, put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly find value, hit me with a super thanks or super chat. Consider joining for a membership or picking up a copy of one of my books. The one most relevant to today is going to be The Green Stone, the one right there in the middle. It is my work on spiritual alchemy, and it ties directly into Carl Jung's works in the Mysterium Conditionis. I believe it to be the completion of that work. I had a key that he was missing, which unlocks the entire understanding. In addition to that, I also, in that same book, expand upon and clearly define the MBTI system and from a system that is subjective into a new system, kind of, that is more objective. With all of that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of psychology and the occult with part three, discussion of the case. This one is an exceedingly long document, right? This part of it's like 50 pages. That would be close to 4 hours. So we're going to try to break it up naturally in the middle somewhere. All right, well, let's go. Three, discussion of the case. This case, in spite of its incompleteness, presents a mass of psychological problems whose detailed discussion would far exceed the compass of this paper. We must therefore be content with a mere sketch of the more remarkable phenomenon. For the sakes of clearer exposition, it seems best to discuss the different states under separate heads. The waking state. Here, the patient shows various peculiarities. As we have seen, she was often absent minded at school, misread in a peculiar way, was moody, changeable, and inconsequent in her own behavior. Now shy, reserved, now quiet, shy, reserved, now uncommonly lively, noisy, and talkative. She cannot be called unintelligent, yet her narrow mindedness is sometimes as striking as her isolated moments of intelligence. Bipolar much. Our memory is good on the whole, but it is often very much impaired by a marked distractibility. Thus, despite numerous discussions and readings of Kerner's Sehiren van Puttivost, she still does not know, after many weeks, whether the author is called Corner or Kerner, or the name of the clairvoyant, if directly asked. Nevertheless, the name Kerner appears correctly written when it occasionally turns up in the automatic communications. In general, it may be said that there is something extremely immoderate, unsteady, almost protean in her character. If we discount the psychological fluctuations of character due to puberty, there still remains a pathological residue which expresses itself in her immoderate reactions and unpredictable, bizarre conduct. One can call this character disequilibrium or unstable. Yes, I like she. This really is describing bipolarism, right? Like the manic and the depressive, the shy, quiet, reserved, and the other side of that being expressive. Now that might be a bipolar schizophrenic, which is a whole different build of woe, but that does appear to be fairly concurrent with it, right? It gets its specific cast from certain features that must be regarded as hysterical. Above all, her distractibility and her dreamy nature must be viewed in this light. As Janet maintains, the basis of hysterical anesthesias is disturbance of attention. he was able to show in youthful hysterics a striking indifference and lack of attention towards everything to do with the sphere of the perceptions. So they like this is where we get into the diagnoses today, right? The ones that were not diagnosed then, but were probably existent. Right? Autism exists, ADHD exists, all of the things do exist, but it seems to be like a sliding scale of things, right? Autism's on one end of the sliding scale, and ADHD is, or not ADHD, obsessive compulsiveness, or things like that are on the other end, right? The tendency to slide away from the perceptions around and into the one particular, right? That's kind of where autism resides, residing in this one particular subject all the time focused. And then the OCD is like everything needs to be right. Everything is in your perception at all of the time. And so you have to be compulsive about that and it has to be in the right place. And so it's, and in between all of that exists, everybody else. And we all have varying degrees of these things within us and we express them in different ways. So I don't really like the way that we use these diagnoses these days, right? Like I'm autistic and so I can't. Is terrible, right? And it may be a limitation, right? You may be focused in a way that is similar to autism, but I really myself on a personal level prefer to reserve those terms for people who are very much affected, right? I've got a neighbor down here, her son is very much affected by autism. It very much affects their everyday life. He has an inability to stay focused at all. He will take off running at the slightest distraction. He's grown now. He's 20 years old and he's a big boy, right? And it very much impacts their life. And to see other people who have a discipline problem more often than not, who have these tendencies on that end of the scale, take that diagnosis and use that as an excuse not to improve themselves. Right? That's where I have a problem with those diagnoses. But these things do exist. Right? These conditions are, and we need to get to the point where we are dealing with it in the this is actually a condition and this is you need to have some discipline, right? We need doctors to have the backbone to be like, no, this is just you taking it too far, right? But these things existed then. Just wasn't diagnosed. And that's what this right here is, right? Most of this striking indifference and lack of attention towards everything in the sphere of the perceptions, well, that is sliding towards the autism end of the scale. That is not being able to focus on the things external. You are focused on this one particular thing, which may be internal. It may be a sound that you hear or a thing on the wall that you see, or it might be this thing that is totally consuming your attention to the point where you're unable to be able to focus into these things. And so this appears to be that. And that, I just wanted to, point that out. It does appear to be like people have this tendency to say, well, 100 years ago, autism wasn't a thing. Yes, it absolutely was, right? That was what the people that they kept in the attics and they didn't tell anybody about. The same is true with most of the other diagnoses as well. And so these things have always existed, even if we didn't have a way to say it is this, right? In the exact same way that we have examples of socialism in the Bible, even if in the time of the Bible there was no understanding of socialism. We can see the example, right? And it is not a good one, even back then, but it wasn't called that. This is the same thing here. It is a difference of definitions, not a non existence of a thing. All right. A notable instance of this, and one to which beautifully, and that's what they were exploring here, right? That's what they were trying to understand. What is the driving force behind this? What is the cause that makes this happen? A notable instance of this, and one which beautifully illustrates hysterical distractibility, is misreading. The psychology of this process may be thought of somewhat as follows. While reading aloud, a person's attention slackens and turns towards some other object. Meanwhile, the reading continues mechanically. The sense impressions are received as before, but owing to the distraction, the excitability of the perceptive center is reduced, so that the strength of the sense impressions is no longer sufficient to fix the attention in such a way as to conduct perceptions along the verbal motor route. In other words, to repress all the inflowing associations which immediately ally themselves with any new sense impression. Well, we have an example of that right here today, right? If you go back to the very beginning of this video, you will see me do this, even though I wasn't reading. Right? I got distracted. I went to start and I realized my mic wasn't here, so I had to swing my mic in and it threw me off my entire game. Right there, that is the exact same thing. That doesn't mean it's a pathology, right? Except if it happens to the point where it is a detriment in your life, right? You are always forgetting the mic, and it is always causing you to do that, and always causing you to lose your sense of whatever you were doing. But yeah, that's funny because like that's literally what happened in the very first seconds of this video today. The further psychological mechanism permits two possible explanations. One, the sense impressions is received unconsciously. An example, below the threshold of consciousness, owing to the rise of the stimulus threshold in the perceptive center, and consequently, it is not taken up by the conscious attention and conducted along the speech route, but only reaches verbal expression through the mediation of the nearest associations. In this case, the dialect expression for the object. Right? This is also like, right, when I'm sitting here and I'm reading, right? I've got a whole nother screen set up on the side right here that's got the recording going on in the comments. And so if I see a comment pop up over here while I'm in the middle of this, it distracts me. Right now, one of the things that I'm doing is working through that sense of distraction. Now, I am not just like I don't want to discourage comments, even when they are off topic, because that's the point of doing the lives. But it is a distraction when it pops up and it takes your mind off of what you are doing, right? What you are reading right now. If you are listening to me and you're doing something else and something particular strikes your fancy and you are distracted from what you were doing, or vice versa, it's the exact same thing. All right. Two, the sense impressions is received consciously, but at the moment of entering the speech route, it reaches a spot whose excitability is reduced by the distraction. At this point, the dialect word is substituted by association for the verbal motor speech image and is uttered in place of it. That is like me saying Freud at the beginning of this video instead of Jung. Right? That's funny. It's like I don't read ahead. I did scan ahead to see when the next section break would be. I try to do that so I know about how to pace it. And uh, it's just funny because I didn't know that that was coming. It was perfectly up to chance, and it fits exactly in what we would need for it, right? That is exactly what happened, right? That the dialect word was substituted by association for the verbal motor speech image. Now, how Freud slipped into there, I don't know, but it happened. All right, back to the text. In either case, it is certain that the acoustic distraction fails to correct the error. Which of the two explanations is the right one cannot be determined in our case. Probably both approach the truth, for the distractibility appears to be general, affecting more than one of the centers involved in the act of reading aloud. In our case, this symptom has a special value because we have here a quite elementary automatic phenomenon. It can be called hysterical because, in this particular case, the state of exhaustion and intoxication with its parallel symptoms can be ruled out. Only in the exceptional circumstances does a healthy person allow himself to be so gripped by an object that he fails to correct the errors due to inattention, especially those of the kind described. The frequency with which this happens in the patient points to a considerable restriction of the field of consciousness, seeing that she can control only a minimum of the elementary perceptions simultaneously flowing in upon her. If we wish to define the psychological state of the psychic shadow side, We might describe it as a sleep or dream state, according to whether passivity or activity is its dominant feature. A pathological dream state of rudimentary scope and intensity is certainly present here. Its genesis is spontaneous, and dream states that arise spontaneously and produce automatisms are usually regarded as hysterical. It must be pointed out that instances of misreading are a frequent occurrence in our patient, and that for this reason the term hysterical is appropriate, because, so far as we know, it is only on the basis of an hysterical constitution that partial sleep or dream states occur both frequently and spontaneously. Uh, the automatic substitution of some adjacent association has been studied experimentally by Binet in his hysterical subjects. When he pricked the anesthetic hand of the patient, she did not feel the prick, but thought of points. When he moved her fingers, she thought of sticks or columns. Again, when the hand, concealed from the patient's sight by a screen, wrote salpêtrière, she saw before her the word salpêtrière in white writing on a black background. This recalls the experiments of Guinan and Sophia Woltke in previously referred to. We thus find in our patient, at a time when there was nothing to suggest the latter phenomenon, rudimentary automatisms, fragments of dreaming, which harbor in themselves the possibility that someday more than one association will slip in between the distractibility of her perceptions and consciousness. The misreading also reveals a certain autonomy of these psychic elements, even with a relatively low degree of distractibility, not in any other way striking or suspicious. They develop a noticeable, if slight, productivity which approximates to that of the physiological dream. The misreading can therefore be regarded as a prodromal symptom of subsequent events, especially as its psychology is the prototype of the mechanism of somnambulistic dreams, which are in fact nothing but a multiplication and infinite variation of the elementary process we have described above. At the time of my observations, I was never able to demonstrate any other rudimentary automatisms of this kind. It seems as if the originally low grade states of distractibility gradually grew beneath the surface of consciousness into those remarkable somnambulistic attacks and therefore disappeared from the waking state. So far as the development of the patient's character is concerned, except for a slight increase in maturity, no striking change could be noted in the course of observations lasting nearly 2 years. On the other hand, it is worth mentioning that in the 2 years since the subsidence, complete cessation, of the somnambulistic attacks, a considerable change of character has taken place. We shall have occasion later on to speak of the significance of this observation. Semi-somnambulism. In our account of S.W.'s case, the following condition was indicated by the term semi-somnambulism. For some time before and after the actual somnambulistic attack, the patient found herself in a state whose most salient feature can best be described as preoccupation. She lent only half an ear to the conversation around her, answered absent-mindedly, frequently lost herself in all manner of hallucinations. Her face was solemn, her look ecstatic, visionary, ardent. Closer observation revealed a far-reaching alteration of her entire character. She was now grave, dignified. When she spoke, the theme was always an extremely serious one. In this state, she could talk so seriously, so forcefully and convincingly that one almost had to ask oneself, is this really a girl of 15 and a half? One had the impression that a mature woman was being acted with considerable dramatic talent. The reason for this seriousness, this solemnity of behavior, was given in the patient's explanation that at these times she stood on the frontier of this world and the next, and associated just as really with the spirits of the dead as with the living. And indeed, her conversation was just about equally divided between answers to objectively real questions and hallucinatory ones. I call this state semi-somnambulistic because it can coincide with Richet's own definition. Such a person's consciousness appears to persist in its integrity, while all the time highly complex operations are taking place outside consciousness, without the voluntary and conscious ego seeming to be aware of any modification at all. He will have another person within him, acting, thinking, and willing, without his consciousness, that is, his conscious, reflecting ego, having the least idea that such is the case. Benet says of the term semi-somnambulism, this term indicates the relations in which this state stands to genuine somnambulism, and further, it gives us to understand that somnambulistic life, which shows itself during the waking state, is overcome and suppressed by the normal consciousness as it reasserts itself. Automatisms. Semi-somnambulism is characterized by the continuity of consciousness with that of the waking state and by the appearance of various automatisms which point to the activity of a subconscious independent of the conscious self. Our case of the following automatic phenomena. 1. Automatic movement of the table. 2. Automatic writing. And 3. Hallucinations. Automatic movements of the table. Before the patient came under my observation, she had been influenced by the suggestion of table turning, which she first came across as a parlor game. As soon as she entered the circle, communications arrived from members of her family, and she was at once recognized as a medium. I could only ascertain that as soon as her hands were placed on the table, the typical movements began. The content of the communications has no further interest for us, but the automatic character of the act itself merits some discussion, for the objection might very well be made that there was some deliberate pushing or pulling on the part of the patient. This is entirely possible, and it can still be something, right? What we see is I've been experimenting with dowsing, and dowsing is using, in what I'm doing, is using metal rods to find and define energetic fields, right? I believe that the earth is a magnet, that there are energetic magnetic fields all over the place, and that you can track them with these things. And there is a certain degree of letting the rods turn on their own, and there's a degree of holding resistance, and sometimes that line between those two is very, very finely defined. But even in the instance of finding something that you are unaware of the location of, this happens often. Like, it is something that is most experimented with in dowsing. There's a certain degree of the environment reinforcing, right? The person who hit it may be making subtle clues that you pick up on, and then you subconsciously making micro adjustments in your hands to make the rods do whatever. But even if that is the case, you are still using something intuitively to find the thing. Now, I've had some extreme reactions from the dowsing, right? Like the rods doing things that absolutely were not within my control. So there is a certain part of this that can go either way, right? It is entirely possible that there are things that can happen, and there is also the possibility that there are things people are making happen, and they don't necessarily have to be deceitful, but most of the time, if they are making it happen, it is probably deceitful. All right, back to the text. As we know from the investigations of Chevreul, Glay, Lehman, and others, unconscious motor phenomena are not only a frequent occurrence among hysterical persons and those pathologically inclined in other ways, but can also be induced fairly easily in normal persons who exhibit no other spontaneous automatisms. I have made many experiments on these lines and can fully confirm this observation. In the great majority of cases, all that is required is enough patience to put up with an hour or so of quiet waiting. With most subjects, motor automatisms will eventually be obtained in more or less high degree, if not hindered by counter suggestions. In a relatively small number of cases, the phenomena arises spontaneously, An example, directly under the influence of verbal suggestions or of some earlier autosuggestion. In our case, the subject was powerfully affected by suggestion. In general, the disposition of the patient is subject to all those laws which also hold good for normal hypnosis. Nevertheless, certain special circumstances must be taken into account which are conditioned by the peculiar nature of the case. It was not a question here of total hypnosis, but of a partial one, limited entirely to the motor area of the arm, like the cerebral anesthesia produced by magnetic passes for a painful spot in the body. We touch the spot in question, employing verbal suggestion or making use of some existing autosuggestion, and we use the tactile stimulus, which we know acts suggestively, to bring about the desired partial hypnosis. In accordance with this procedure, refractory subjects can be brought easily enough to an exhibition of automatism. The experimenter intentionally gives the table a slight push, or better, a series of light rhythmical taps. After a while, he notices that the oscillations become stronger, and they continue, although he has stopped his own intentional movements. The experiment has succeeded. The subject has unsuspectingly taken up the suggestion. Through this procedure, far better results are obtained than by verbal suggestion. With very receptive persons, and in all those cases where the movement seems to start spontaneously, the intended tremors, which are not, of course, perceptible to the subject, take over the role of agent provocateur. In this way, persons who by themselves would never achieve automatic movements of the coarser type can sometimes assume unconscious control of the table movements, provided that the tremors are strong enough for the medium to understand their meaning. The medium then takes over the slight oscillations and gives them back considerably strengthened, but rarely at exactly the same moment, mostly a few seconds later, and in this way reveals the agent's conscious or unconscious thought. This simple mechanism may give rise to instances of thought reading, which are quite bewildering at first sight. A very simple experiment that works in many cases with unpracticed persons will serve to illustrate this. The experimenter thinks, say, of the number 4 and then waits, his hands quietly resting on the table, until he feels it making the first move to announce the number thought of. He lifts his hands off of the table immediately, and the number will be correctly tilted out. It is advisable in this experiment to stand the table on a soft, thick carpet. By paying close attention, the experimenter will occasionally notice a movement of the table that can be represented thus: 1. Intended tremors, too slight to be perceived by the subject. 2. Very small but perceptible oscillations of the table which show that the subject is responding to them. 3. Big movements, tilts of the table, giving the number 4 that was thought of. I don't know what this figure is for. AB denotes the movement when the operator's hands are removed. Okay, so this is the vibrations at 1. This is going to be the oscillations at 2, and this is going to be the return oscillations at 3. Okay. This experiment works excellently with the well-disposed, inexperienced persons. After a little practice, the phenomena usually disappears, since with practice the number can be read and reproduced directly from the intended movements. With a responsive medium, these intended tremors work in just the same way as the intentional taps on the experiment cited above. They are received, strengthened, and reproduced, though very gently, almost timidly. Even so, they are perceptible and therefore act suggestively as slight tactile stimuli. And with the increase of partial hypnosis, they produce a big automatic movements. This experiment illustrates the clearest way to gradual increase of autosuggestion. Along the path of this autosuggestion, all of the automatic motor phenomena develop. How the mental content gradually intrudes into the purely motor sphere scarcely needs explaining after the above discussion. No special suggestion is required to evoke the mental phenomenon, since, from the standpoint of the experimenter at least, It was a question of verbal representation from the start. After the first random motor expressions are over, unpracticed subjects soon begin reproducing verbal products of their own or the intentions of the experimenter. The intrusion of the mental content can be objectively understood as follows. Through the gradual increase of autosuggestion, the motor areas of the arm are isolated from consciousness. That is to say, the perception of slight motor impulses is veiled from the mind. The knowledge received via consciousness of potential mental content produces a collateral excitation in the speech area as the nearest available means to mental formulation. The intention to formulate necessarily affects the motor components of the verbal representation most of all, thus explaining the unconscious overflow of speech impulses into the motor area. And conversely, the gradual penetration of partial hypnosis into the speech area. In numerous experiments with beginners, I have noticed, usually at the start of the mental phenomenon, a relatively large number of completely meaningless words, often only senseless jumbles of letters. Later, all sorts of absurdities are produced, words or whole sentences with the letters transposed, all higgledy-piggledy, or arranged in reverse order, like mirror writing. I love that that is included in here, right? Higgledy-piggledy, because, that's funny. Good morning, guys. Good morning. Nice to see y'all. Nice to see y'all. Higgledy-piggledy. The appearance of a letter or word brings a new suggestion. Involuntarily, some kind of association tacks onto it and is then realized. Curiously enough, these are not as a rule, conscious associations, but quite unexpected ones. This would seem to indicate that a considerable part of the speech area is already hypnotically isolated. The recognition of this automatism again forms a fruitful suggestion, since at this point a feeling of strangeness invariably arises, as if it was not already present in the pure motor automatism. The question, who is doing this? Who is speaking? Acts as a suggestion for synthesizing the unconscious personality, which as a rule is not long in coming. Some name or other presents itself, usually one charged with emotion, and the automatic splitting of the personality is accomplished. How haphazard and precarious this synthesis is at first can be seen from the following reports from the literature. Myers gives the following interesting observation of Mr. A member for the Society for Cyclical Research, who was experimenting on himself with automatic writing. Third day. What is the man? Tefi Hassel Esable Lies. Is that an anagram? Yes. How many words does it contain? 5. What is the first word? C. What is the second word? E. C. Shall I interpret it myself? Try to. Mr. A found this solution. The life is less able. He was astonished at this intellectual pronouncement, which seemed to him to prove the existence of an intelligence independent of his own. He went on then to ask, what? I. Okay. Who are you? Clelia. Are you a woman? Yes. Have you lived on Earth? No. Will you come to life? Yes. When? In 6 years. Why are you conversing with me? Pound of Clelia L. Mr. A interpreted this answer as, I clearly feel. You can interpret it that way, but I don't know why. Am I the one who asked this? Am I the one who asked questions? Yes. Is Clelia there? No. Oh, this is the 4th day. Who is there here then? Nobody. Does Clelia exist at all? No. Then whom was I speaking yesterday? With nobody. That is interesting. Janet conducted the following conversation with the subconscious of Lucy, who meanwhile was engaged in conversation with another observer. Janet asks, do you hear me? Lucy answers in automatic writing, no. But one has to hear in order to answer. Absolutely. Then how do you do it? I don't know. It must be someone who hears me. Yes. Who is it? Someone besides Lucy. All right, somebody else. Shall we give it to the other person a name? No. Yes, it would be more convenient. All right, Adrienne. Well, Adrienne, do you hear me? Yes. One can see from these extracts how the unconscious personality builds itself up. It owes its existence simply to suggestive questions, which strike an answering chord in the medium's own disposition. This disposition can be explained by the disintegration of psychic complexes, and the feeling of strangeness evoked by these automatisms assists the process as soon as conscious attention is directed to the automatic act. Binet remarks on this experiment of Janet's. Nevertheless, it should be carefully noted that if the personality of Adrienne could be created, it was because the suggestion encountered a psychological possibility. In other words, disaggregated phenomena was existing there apart from the normal consciousness of the subject. The individualization of the subconscious is always a great step forward and has enormous suggestive influence on further development of the automatisms. The formation of unconscious personalities, in our case, must be regarded as in this light. The objection of the objection that the table turning was simulated may well be abandoned when one considers the phenomena of thought reading from intended tremors, of which the patient gave ample proof. Rapid, conscious thought reading requires, at the very least, an extraordinary amount of practice, and this the patient demonstrably lacked. Whole conversations can be carried on by means of these tremors, as happened in our case. In the same way, the suggestibility of the subconscious can be demonstrated objectively if, for instance, the operator concentrates on the thought. The medium's hand shall no longer move the table or the glass, and at once, contrary to all expectation, and to the liveliest astonishment of the subject, the table is immobilized. Naturally, all kinds of other suggestions can be realized too, provided that their innervation does not exceed the area of partial hypnosis, which proves at the same time the partial nature of the hypnosis. Hence, suggestions aimed at the legs or the other arm will not work. Interesting. The table turning was not an automatism confined exclusively to the patient's semi somnambulism. On the contrary, it occurred in its most pronounced form in the waking state, and in most cases was then passed over into semi somnambulism, whose onset was generally announced by hallucinations, as at the first seance. 2. Automatic writing. Another automatic phenomena, which from the first corresponds to a higher degree of partial hypnosis, is automatic writing. It is, at least in my experience, much rarer and much more difficult to produce than table turning. Here again, it is a question of a primary suggestion directed to the conscious mind when sensibility is retained, and to the unconscious when it is extinct. The suggestion, however, is not a simple one, since it already contains an intellectual element. To write means to write something. This special property of the suggestion, going beyond the purely motor sphere, often confuses the subject and gives rise to counter-suggestions, which prevent the appearance of automatisms. However, I have noticed in a few cases that the suggestion is realized despite its comparative boldness. It is, after all, directed to the waking consciousness of the so called normal person, but that it does so in a peculiar way by putting only the purely motor parts of the central nervous system under hypnosis, and that the deeper hypnosis is then obtained from the motor phenomenon by autosuggestion, as in the procedure for table turning described above. The subject, holding a pencil in his hand, is purposely engaged in conversation to distract his attention from writing. The hand thereupon starts to move, making a number of strokes and zigzag lines at first, or else a simple line. This sometimes happens that the pencil does not touch the paper at all, but writes in the air. These movements must be regarded as purely motor phenomena corresponding to the expression of the motor elements in the idea of writing. They are somewhat rare. Usually, single letters are written right off, and what was said above of table turning is true here in their combination into words and sentences. Right, this is just an example of the lines and then the zigzags. Now and then, true mirror writing is observed. In the majority of cases, and perhaps in all experiments with beginners who are not under some special suggestion, the automatic writing is that of the subject. Occasionally, its character may be greatly changed, but this is secondary, and it's always a symptom of the synthesis of a subconscious personality. As already stated, the automatic writing of our patients never came to very much. The experiments were carried out in the dark, and in most cases, she passed over into semi somnambulism or ecstasy. So the automatic writing had the same result as the preliminary table turning. 3. Hallucinations. The manner of transition to somnambulism in the second seance is of psychological significance. As reported, the automatic phenomena were in full swing when darkness descended. The interesting event in the preceding seance was the brusque interruption of a communication from the grandfather, which became the starting point for various discussions among members of the circle. These two factors, darkness and a remarkable occurrence, seem to have caused a rapid deepening of hypnosis, which enabled the hallucinations to develop. The psychological mechanism of this process seems to be as follows. The influence of darkness on suggestibility, particularly in regard to the sense organs, is well known. Binet states that it has a special influence on hysterical subjects, producing immediate drowsiness. As may be assumed from the foregoing explanations, the patient was in a state of partial hypnosis. And furthermore, a subconscious personality, having the closest ties with the speech area, had already constituted itself. The automatic expression of this personality was interrupted in the most unexpected way by a new person whose existence no one suspected. Whence came this split? Obviously, the patient had entertained the liveliest expectations about this first seance. Any reminiscences she had of me and my family had probably grouped themselves around this feeling of expectation, and they suddenly came to light when the automatic expression was at its climax. The fact that it was my grandfather and no one else, not for instance my dead father, who, as the patient knew, was closer to me than my grandfather, whom I had never known, may suggest where the origin of this new person is to be sought. It was probably a dissociation from the already existing personality, and this split off part seized upon the nearest available material for its expression, namely the associations concerning myself. Whether this offers a parallel to the results of Freud's dream investigations must remain unanswered, for we have no means of judging how far the emotion in question may be considered repressed. From the brusque intervention of the new personality, we may conclude that the patient's imaginings were extremely vivid, with a correspondingly intense expectation, which a certain maidenly modesty and embarrassment sought perhaps to overcome. At any rate, this event reminds us vividly of the way dreams suddenly present to consciousness in more or less transparent symbolism, things one has never admitted to oneself clearly and openly. We do not know when the splitting off of the new personality occurred, whether it had been slowly preparing in the unconscious, or whether it only came about during the seance. In any case, it meant a considerable increase in the extent of the unconscious area rendered accessible by the hypnosis. At the same time, this event, in view of the impression it made on the waking consciousness of the patient, must be regarded as powerfully suggestive, for the perception of the unexpected intervention of a new personality was bound to increase still further the feelings of strangeness aroused by the automatism, and would naturally suggest the thought that an independent spirit was making itself known. From this followed the very understandable association that it might be possible to see this spirit. The situation that ensued at the second seance can be explained by the coincidence of this energizing suggestion with the heightened suggestibility occasioned by the darkness. The hypnosis, and with it the chain of split off ideas, breaks through into the visual sphere. The expression of the unconscious, hitherto purely motor, is objectified in accordance with the specific energy of the newly created system, in the form of visual images, the having the character of a hallucination, not as a mere accompaniment of the verbal automatism, but as a direct substitute function. The explanation of the unexpected situation that arose in the first seance, at the time quite inexplicable, is no longer given in words, but as an allegorical vision. The proposition, they do not hate one another, but are friends, is expressed in a picture of the two grandfathers arm in arm. We frequently come across such things in somnambulism. The thinking of somnambulists proceeds in plastic images, which constantly breaks through into this or that sensory sphere and are objectified as hallucinations. The thought process sinks into the subconscious and only in its final terms reach consciousness directly as hallucinations or as vivid and consciously colored ideas, sensuously colored ideas. In our case, the same thing occurred as with the patient, whose anesthetic hand Benet pricked 9 times, making her think vividly of the number 9, or Flournoy's Helene Smith, who, on being asked in her shop about a certain pattern, suddenly saw before her the figure 18, 8 to 10 inches high, representing the number of days the pattern had been on loan. The question arises as to why the automatism broke through in the visual sphere and not in the acoustic. There are several reasons for this choice of the visual. A. The patient was not gifted acoustically, and she was, for instance, very unmusical. B. There was no silence to correspond with the darkness, which might have favored the occurrence of auditory hallucinations, for we were talking all the time. C. The heightened conviction of the near presence of spirits, owing to the feeling of strangeness evoked by the automatism, could easily lead to the idea that it might be possible to see a spirit, thus causing a slight excitation of the visual sphere. The entropic phenomena in the darkness favored the appearance of hallucinations. The reasons given in C and D are of decisive importance for the appearance of hallucinations. The entropic phenomena, in this case, play the same role in producing automatisms by autosuggestion as do the slight tactile stimuli during hypnosis of the motor centers. As reported, the patient saw sparks before passing into the first hallucinatory twilight state at the first seance. Obviously, attention was already at high pitch and directed to visual perceptions, so that the light sensations of the retina, usually very weak, were seen with great intensity. The part played by entropic perceptions of light in the production of hallucinations discovers and deserves closer scrutiny. Schuley says, the swarm of lights and colors that excite and activate the nocturnal field of vision in the darkness supplies the material for the fantastic figures seen in the air before going to sleep. That is entirely possible, right? We produce DMT, dimethyltryptamine, at birth and at death. There's a definite possibility that we do so when we go into a deep sleep, which may be responsible for these dreams in general, right? That is not, as far as I am aware, hard science. It is, you know, research, and so don't take that as fact and run with it. But I think that that's a thing that they are discovering. Uh, you can stimulate these things for yourself, right? I do have in the book how to do that, and you can produce those effects through conscious decision by the flexation of certain muscles. Uh, that is definitely something worth looking into. As we know, we never see absolute darkness. Always a few patches in the dark field are dully illuminated. Flecks of light bob up here and there and combine into all sorts of shapes, and it only needs a moderately active imagination to form them out, as one does out of clouds, certain figures known to oneself personally. That is interesting, right? I have aphantasia. I don't have the capacity to visualize anything willfully for myself. I cannot close my eyes and envision a blade of grass, a box, or anything, a tree, a cloud. It doesn't matter. I have recently, through the procedures that I talk about, been healing that, and I can willfully call up colors and make them rotate, right? They swirl. That is the best I got so far. I am still working on it, but I'm not able to consciously pull up any images. I do, however, see these swirls, right? I've had a revelatory process by which, through the meditative state, I have been able to moderate those swirls. Now, I can turn those not into an image, but I can kind of clear the field to the point where there's no longer those visual swirls. It is a blank canvas, and that is what I can change into colors. All of that is new, right? And I do that by moving my hands. Oddly enough, right? I move the energy through my hands while tying into the third eye and the sacral. Right? There's a procedure that goes into that, but it's meditative. It's not, physical. But then I move the energy out through, and then that's when I can move through my hands. I can clear the field by moving my hands in and out and adjusting them as if I am holding a ball. Doing that has allowed me to be able to visualize in a way that I was never able to do before, but I still cannot see things. So the flecks of light, they combine and move. They don't necessarily form shapes that are recognizable. Uh, and I just wanted to point that out because I do have a somewhat different viewpoint on that particular thing than most people. I mean, aphantasia is less than 5% of the population. I think it's less than 3%. So it's just a different way of looking at it, I guess. As one falls asleep, one's fading power of judgment leaves the imagination free to construct more and more vivid forms. Instead of the spots of light, the haziness and changing colors of the dark visual field, outlines of definite objects begin to appear. Hypnagogic hallucinations arise in this way. Naturally, the chief share falls to the imagination, which is why highly imaginative people are particularly subject to them. The hypnopompic hallucinations described by Myers are essentially the same as hypnagogic ones. It is very probable that hypnagogic images are identical with the dream images of normal sleep, or that they form their visual foundation. Maury has proved by self observation that the images which floated around him hypnagogically were also the objects of the dreams that followed. Ladd showed the same thing even more convincingly. With practice, he succeeded in waking himself up 2 to 5 minutes after falling asleep. Each time he noticed that the bright figures dancing before the retina formed, as it were, the outlines of the images just dreamed of. He even supposes that practically all the visual dreams derive their formal elements from the light sensations of the retina. In our case, the situation favored the development of a fantastic interpretation. Also, we must not underrate the influence of the tense expectation which, caused by the dull light sensations of the retina, to appear with increased intensity. The development of retinal phenomena then followed in accordance with the predominant ideas. Hallucinations have been observed to arise in this way with other visionaries. Joan of Arc saw first a cloud of light, then, out of it, a little later, stepped St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. Swedenborg saw nothing for a whole hour but luminous spheres and brilliant flames. All the time he felt a tremendous change going on in his brain, which seemed to him like a release of light. I can talk to you about that one. An hour afterwards, he suddenly saw real figures whom he took to be angels and spirits. The sun vision of Benvenuto Cellini in St. Angelo probably belongs to the same category. A student who often saw apparitions said, When these apparitions come, I see at first only single masses of light and hear at the same time a dull roaring in my ears. But after a bit, these outlines turn into distinct figures. The hallucinations arise in quite the classical way with Flournoy's Helen Smith. I cite the relevant passage from his report. March 18. Attempt to experiment in the darkness. Millie Smith sees a balloon, now luminous, now becoming more dark. That's Mademoiselle, I guess. I'm not familiar with that abbreviation. March 25th, Mademoiselle Smith begins to distinguish vague gleams with long white streamers moving from the floor to the ceiling, and then a magnificent star, which in the darkness appears to her alone throughout the whole seance. April 1st. Mademoiselle Smith is very much agitated. She has fits of shivering, is very cold. She is very restless and sees suddenly hovering above the table a grinning, very ugly face with long red hair. Afterwards, she sees a magnificent bouquet of roses of different hues. Suddenly, she sees a small snake come out from underneath the bouquet. It rises up gently, smells the flowers, and looks at them. Grounding is so very important. Concerning the origin of her Mars visions, Helene Smith said, "The red light continues about me, and I find myself surrounded by extraordinary flowers." At all times, the complex hallucinations of visionaries have occupied a special place in scientific criticism. Thus, quite early, Macario distinguished them as intuitive hallucinations from ordinary hallucinations, saying that they occur in persons of lively mind, deep understanding, and high nervous excitability. Hecker expresses himself in a similar manner, but even more enthusiastically. He supposes their conditioning factor to be the congeniality high development of the psychic organ, which, through its spontaneous activity, calls the life of the imagination into play and free and nimble play. Yeah, I know where that organ is and how to flex those muscles. These hallucinations are harbingers and also signs of immense spiritual power. A vision is actually a higher excitation which adapts itself harmoniously to the most perfect health of mind and body. Complex hallucinations do not belong to the waking state, but occur, as a rule, in a state of partial waking. The visionary is sunk in his vision to the point of complete absorption. Flournoy, too, was always able to distinguish a sudden degree of obnubilation during the visions of Helene Smith. In our case, the vision is complicated by a sleeping state, whose peculiarities we shall discuss below. The change in character. The most striking figure of the second state is the change in character. There are several cases in the literature which show this symptom of spontaneous change in the character of a person. The first to be made known was in a scientific journal was that of Mary Reynolds, published by Weir Mitchell. This was the case of a young woman living in Pennsylvania in 1811. After a deep sleep of about 20 hours, she had totally forgotten her entire past and everything she had ever learned. Even the words she had spoke had lost their meaning. She no longer knew her relatives. Slowly, she relearned to read and write, but her writing now was from right to left. More striking still was the change in her character. Instead of being melancholy, she was now cheerful to extremity. Instead of being reserved, she was buoyant and social. Formerly taciturn and retiring, she was now merry and jocose. Her disposition was totally and absolutely changed. In this state, she gave up entirely her former secluded life and liked to set out on adventurous expeditions unarmed, through woods and mountains on foot and on horseback. On one of these expeditions, she encountered a large black bear, which she took for a pig. The bear stood up on its hind legs and gnashed his teeth at her. As she could not induce the horses to go any further, she went up to the bear with an ordinary stick and hit him until he took flight. I bet that is a white woman. 5 weeks later, I don't play into stereotypes much, but every once in a while it's funny, right? Like, You can't get the horse to go up to the bear, so you're just going to grab a stick and run up to it. That is white woman energy. 5 weeks later, after a deep sleep, she returned to her earlier state with amnesia for the interval. These states alternated for about 16 years, but the last 25 years of her life, Mary Reynolds passed exclusively in the second state. Schroeder van de Kolk reports the following case. The patient became ill at the age of 16 with a periodic amnesia after a previous long illness of 3 years. Sometimes in the morning after waking, she fell into a peculiar choreic state, during which she made rhythmical beating movements with her arms. Throughout the day, she would behave in a childish, silly way, as if she had lost all her educated faculties. When normal, she was very intelligent, well read, spoke excellent French. In the second state, she began to speak French faultily. On the second day, she was always normal again. The two states were completely separated by amnesia. Hofeld reports on a case of spontaneous somnambulism in a girl who, in her normal state, was submissive and modest, but in somnambulism was impertinent, rude, and violent. Azam's Philidia was, in her normal state, depressed, inhibited, timid, and in the second state, lively, confident, enterprising to recklessness. The second state gradually became the dominant one and finally supplanted the first to such an extent that the patient called her normal states, which now lasted only a short time, her crises. The amnesiac attacks had begun at the age of 14. In time, the second state became more moderate, and there was a certain approximation in the character between of the two states. A very fine example of changing character is the case worked out by Camusset, Ribot, Legrand des Saules, Richer, and Voisin, and put together by Barou and Barot. It is that of Louis V, a case of severe male hysteria with an amnesiac alternating character. In the first state, he was rude, cheeky, querulous, greedy, thievish, inconsiderate. In the second state, he showed an agreeable, sympathetic character and was industrious, docile, and obedient. The amnesiac changing character has been put to literary use by Paul Landau in his play Der Andere. A case that parallels Landau's criminalistic public prosecutor is reported on by Rieger. The subconscious personalities of Janet's Lucy Ann Leone or of Morton's Prince patient can also be regarded as parallels of our case, though these were artificial therapeutic products whose importance lies rather in the domain of dissociated consciousness and memory. In all these cases, the second state is separated from the first by an amnesiac split, and the change in character is accompanied by a break in the continuity of consciousness. In our case, there is no amnesiac disturbance whatever. The transition from the first to the second state is quite gradual. Continuity of consciousness is preserved so that the patient carries over into the waking state everything she has experienced of the otherwise unknown regions of the unconscious during hallucinations in the second state. Periodic changes in personality without an amnesiac split are found in cyclic insanity, but they occur as a rare phenomenon in hysteria, as Renardin's case shows. A young man, whose behavior had always been exemplary, suddenly began to display the worst tendencies. No symptoms of insanity were observed, but on the other hand, the whole surface of his body was found to be anesthetic. This state was periodic. And, in the same way, the patient's character was subject to fluctuations. As soon as the anesthesia disappeared, he became manageable and friendly. The moment it returned, he was dominated by the worst impulses, including even the lust for murder. If we remember that our patient's age at the beginning of the disturbances was 15, an example that the age of puberty had just been reached, we must suppose that there was some connection between these disturbances and the physiological changes of character at puberty. At this period of life, there appears in the consciousness of the individual a new group of sensations together with the ideas and feelings arising therefrom. this continual pressure of unaccustomed mental states, which constantly make themselves felt because their cause is constantly at work, and which are coordinated with one another because they spring from one and the same source, must in the end bring about far reaching changes in the constitution of the ego. Um, there is an understanding about the age and the changes, right? Now, there is different definitions of that. I like the number 8. And so for me, the breakdowns of 8 actually work a lot better, but uh, it is 8 years old, 16. But the other one is 7 and 14, right? 7 and 14 being the general ages of reaching consciousness on a real level, right? You get a little bit of it around 5, but you really, like most people, don't have memories that extend back past 3rd grade, with rare exception, right? Something that is extraordinary in the kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade may be remembered, but generally speaking, most people's memories really begin at 3rd grade, which is about 8 years old, right? That is the real grasp of consciousness, that when you really start to learn to self-determine. Everything prior to that is really explore the world, learn what these sensations are, coordinate the temple so that you can actually navigate through 5D space. And then you get, okay, now I'm dealing with complicated emotions. I'm dealing with interpersonal relationships. I'm learning how to separate myself from my parents and how to become the person that I'm going to be. And then when you get up around either 21 or 24, depending on which way you go, you get more of an understanding of who you really are, right? All of that was a learning experience. And now I get to apply that in real life. For me, that threshold, that 3rd threshold, is more around 24 than it is 21. So for me, that is where the definitions are going to be. But that is by no means a hard and fast rule or law. But it does seem to correlate fairly well with the separation of conscious states and the exploration of self. So I just wanted to point out that there is that whole situation there. So we all know the fitful moods, the confused, new, powerful feelings, the tendency to romantic ideas, to exalted religiosity and mysticism, side by side with relapses into childishness, which give the adolescent his peculiar character. At this period, he is making his first clumsy attempts at independence in every direction. For the first time, he uses for his own purposes all that family and school have inculcated into him in childhood. He conceives ideals, constructs lofty plans for the future, lives in dreams whose main content is ambition and self complacency. All this is physiological. The puberty of a psychopath is a serious crisis. Not only do the psychophysical changes run an exceedingly stormy course, but features of an inherited degenerate character, which do not appear in the child at all, or only sporadically, now become fixed. In explaining our case, we are bound to consider a specifically pubertal disturbance. The reasons for this will appear from a more detailed study of her 2nd personality. For the sake of brevity, we shall call this 2nd personality Ivanus, as the patient herself christened her higher ego. Ivanus is the direct continuation of her everyday ego. She comprises its whole conscious content. In the semi somnambulistic state, her relation to the external world is analogous to that of the waking state. That is to say, she is influenced by recurrent current hallucinations, but no more than persons who are subject to non confusional psychotic hallucinations. The continuity of Evanescence obviously extends to the hysterical attacks as well, when she enacts dramatic scenes, has visionary experiences, etc. During the attack, she is usually isolated from the external world, does not notice what is going on around her, does not know that she is talking loudly, etc. But she has no amnesia for the dream content of the attack, nor is there always amnesia for her motor expressions and for the changes in her surroundings. That this is dependent on the degree of somnambulistic stupor and on the partial paralysis of individual sense organs is proved by the occasion when the patient did not notice me, despite the fact that her eyes were open and that she probably saw the others, but only perceived my presence when I spoke to her. This is the case of so called systematic anesthesia, negative hallucination, which is frequently observed among hysterics. Flournoy, for instance, reports of Helene Smith that during the seances, she suddenly ceased to see those taking part, although she still heard their voices and felt their touch, or that she suddenly stopped hearing, although she saw the speakers moving their lips, etc. Just as evidence is a continuation of the waking ego, so she carries over her whole conscious content into the waking state. This remarkable behavior argues strongly against any analogy with cases of double consciousness. The characteristics reported of Evanis contrast favorably with those of the patient. She is the calmer, more composed personality, and her pleasing modesty and reserve, her more uniform intelligence, her confident way of talking may be regarded as an improvement on the patient's whole being. Thus, there is some resemblance to Janet's Leone, but there is no more than a resemblance. They are divided by a deep psychological difference, quite apart from the question of amnesia. Leone, too, is the healthier, the more normal. She has regained her natural capacities. She represents the temporary amelioration of a chronic condition of hysteria. Ivanus gives more the impression of an artificial product. She is more contrived, and despite all her excellent points, she strikes one as playing a part superlatively well. Her world weariness, her longing for the beyond, are not mere piety, but the attributes of saintliness. Evanis is no longer quite human. She is a mystic being who only half belongs to the world of reality. Her mournful features, her suffering resignation, her mysterious fate, all lead us to the historical prototype of Evanis, Justinus Kerner's clairvoyant of Preverost. I assume that the content of Kerner's book is generally known, so I omit references to the features they have in common. Evanis, however, is not just a copy of the clairvoyant. The latter is simply a sketch for the original. The patient pours her own soul into the role of the clairvoyant, seeking to create out of it an ideal of virtue and perfection. She anticipates her own future and embodies in Evanis what she wishes to be in 20 years' time: the assured, influential, wise, gracious, pious lady. In the construction of the second personality lies the deep seated difference between Leonie 2 and Evanis. Both are psychogenic, but whereas Leonie 1 obtains in Leonie 2 what properly belongs to her, the patient builds up a personality beyond herself. One cannot say that she deludes herself into the higher ideal state. Rather, she dreams herself into it. The realization of this dream is very reminiscent of the psychology of the pathological swindler. Delbrick and Forel have pointed out the importance of autosuggestion in the development of pathological cheating and pathological daydreaming. Pick regards intense autosuggestion as the first symptom of hysterical dreamers, which makes the realization of daydreams possible. One of Pick's patients dreamt herself into a morally dangerous situation and finally carried out an attempted rape on herself by laying naked on the floor and tying herself to the table and chairs. The patient may create some dramatic personage with whom they enter into correspondence by letter, as in Bones' case, where the patient dreamt herself into an engagement with a completely imaginary lawyer and niece, from whom she received letters which she had written herself in disguised handwriting. This pathological dreaming, with its autosuggestive falsifications of memory, sometimes amounting to actual delusions and hallucinations, is also found in the lives of many saints. It is only a step from dreamy ideas with a strong sensuous coloring to complex hallucinations proper. For instance, in Pick's first case, one can see how the patient, who imagined she was the Empress Elizabeth, gradually lost herself in her reveries to such an extent that her condition must be regarded as a true twilight state. Later, it passed over into an hysterical delirium in which her dream fantasies became typical hallucinations. The pathological liar who lets himself be swept away by his fantasies behaves exactly like a child who loses himself in the game he is playing, or like an actor who surrenders completely to his part. There is no fundamental distinction between this and the somnambulistic dissociation of the personality, but only a difference of degree based on the intensity of the primary autosuggestibility or disaggregation of these psychic elements. The more consciousness becomes dissociated, the greater becomes the plasticity of the dream situations, and the less, too, the amount of conscious lying and of consciousness in general. This state of being carried away by one's interest in the object is what Freud calls hysterical identification. For instance, Erler's patient, a severe hysteric, had hypnagogic visions of little riders made of paper, who so took possession of her imagination that she had the feeling of being herself one of them. Much the same sort of thing normally happens to us in dreams when we cannot help thinking hysterically. Complete surrender to the interesting idea explains the wonderful naturalness of these pseudological or somnambulistic performances, which is quite beyond the reach of conscious acting. The less the waking consciousness intervenes with its reflection and calculation, the more certain and convincing becomes the objectification of the dream. Our case has still another analogy with pseudologia fantastica. Pseudologia, the development of fantasies during the attacks. Many cases are known in the literature of fits of pathological lying, accompanied by various hysteriform complaints. Our patient develops her fantasy systems exclusively during the attack. In her normal state, she is quite incapable of thinking out new ideas or explanations. She must either put herself into the somnambulistic state or await its spontaneous appearance. This exhausts the affinities with pseudologia fantastica and pathological dreaming. Our patient differs essentially from pathological dreamers in that it could never be proved that her reveries had previously been the object of her daily interests. Her dreams came up explosively, suddenly bursting forth with amazing completeness from the darkness of the unconscious. The same thing happened with Flournoy's Helene Smith. At several points, however, it is possible, in our case, to demonstrate the link with perceptions in the normal state. See next paragraph. So it seems probable that the roots of those dreams were originally feeling toned ideas, which only occupied her waking consciousness for a short time. We must suppose that hysterical forgetfulness plays a not inconsiderable role in the origin of such dreams. Many ideas, which in themselves would be worth preserving in consciousness, sink below the threshold. Associated trains of thought get lost, and thanks to the psychic dissociation, go on working in the unconscious. We meet the same process again in the genesis of our own dreams. And apparently, sudden and unexpected reveries of the patient can be explained in this way. The total submersion of the conscious personality in the dream role is also the indirect cause of the development of simultaneous automatisms. A second condition may also occasion the division of the consciousness. It is not an alteration of sensibility, but it is rather a peculiar attitude of the mind, the concentration of attention on a single thing. The result of this state of concentration is that the mind is absorbed to the exclusion of other things, and to such a degree insensible that the way is open for automatic actions, and these actions, becoming more complicated, as in the preceding case, may assume a psychic character and constitute intelligences of a parasitic kind, existing side by side with the normal personality, which is not aware of them. Our patient's romances throw a most significant light on the subjective roots of her dreams. They swarm with open and secret love affairs, with illegitimate births and other sexual innuendos. The hub of all these ambiguous stories is a lady whom she dislikes and who gradually turns into her polar opposite. For whereas Evanescence is the pinnacle of virtue, this lady is a sink of iniquity. But the patient's reincarnation theory, in which she appears as the ancestral mother of countless thousands, springs, in all of its naive nakedness, straight from an exuberant fantasy which is so very characteristic of the puberty period. It is the woman's premonition of sexual feeling, the dream of fertility that has created these monstrous ideas in the patient. We shall not be wrong if we seek the main cause of this curious clinical picture in her budding sexuality. From this point of view, the whole essence of Evidence and her enormous family is nothing but a dream of sexual wish fulfillment, which differs from the dream of a night only in that it is spread over many months and years. Nature of the somnambulistic attacks. So far, there is one point in SW's history that has not been discussed, and that is the nature of her attacks. In the second seance, she was suddenly seized with a sort of fainting fit, from which she awoke with a recollection of various hallucinations. According to her own statement, she had not lost consciousness for a moment. Judging from the outward symptoms and course of these attacks, one is inclined to think of narcolepsy or lethargy, as of the kind described, for instance, by Lowenfeld. This is the more plausible since we know that one member of her family, the grandmother, had once had an attack of lethargy. So it is conceivable that our patient inherited the lethargic disposition, Lowenfeld. One often observes hysterical fits of convulsions at spiritualistic seances. Our patient never showed any symptoms of convulsions, but instead, she had those peculiar sleeping states. Etiologically, two elements must be considered for the first attack. One, the influence of hypnosis, and two, psychic excitation. One, influence of partial hypnosis. Janet observed that subconscious automatisms have a hypnotic influence and can bring about complete somnambulism. He made the following experiment. While the patient, who was fully awake, was engaged in conversation by a second observer, Janet stationed himself behind her as a means of whispered and, by means of whispered suggestions, made her unconsciously move her hand, write, and answer questions by signs. Suddenly, the patient broke off the conversation, turned round, and with supraliminal consciousness, continued the previous subconscious talk with Janet. She had fallen into hypnotic somnambulism. In this example, we see a process similar to our case. But for certain reasons to be discussed later, the sleeping state cannot be regarded as hypnotic. We therefore come to the question of 2. Psychic excitation. It is reported for that the first time Bettina Britanno met Gauthier, she suddenly fell asleep on his knee. Ecstatic sleep in the midst of extreme torture, the so-called witch's sleep, is a well-known phenomenon in the annals of witchcraft. Or it's called fainting, right? With susceptible subjects. How many witches were burned in Salem? 0. With susceptible subjects, comparatively small stimuli are enough to induce somnambulistic states. For example, a sensitive lady had to have a splinter cut out of her finger. Without any kind of bodily change, she suddenly saw herself sitting beside a brook in a beautiful meadow plucking flowers. This condition lasted all through the minor operation and then vanished without having any special after effects. That is what people are told to do in the meditative state, right? And that is one of the things that I can't do, so I can't talk a whole lot about it, but that is what they tell you to do, right? Picture yourself walking down steps, and then those steps open up into a garden, and then you walk into the garden, you walk down some more steps, down to the river, and the river is flowing, and that is what they tell you to do. So Lowenfeld observed the unintentional introduction of hysterical lethargy by hypnosis. Our case has certain resemblances to hysterical lethargy as described by Lowenfeld. Superficial respiration, lowering of the pulse, corpse like pallor of the face, Also, peculiar feelings of dying and thoughts of death. Retention of one or more of the senses is no argument against lethargy. For instance, in certain cases of apparent death, the sense of hearing remains. In Bon Masson's case, not only was the sense of touch retained, but the senses of hearing and smell were sharpened. Hallucinations and loud speaking of hallucinatory persons are also met with lethargy. As a rule, there is total amnesia for the lethargic interval. Lowenfeld's case, D, had a vague memory afterwards. And in Bonamasson's case, there was no amnesia. Lethargic patients do not prove accessible to the usual stimuli for rousing them, but Lowenfeld succeeded with his patient, Saint, in changing the lethargy into hypnosis by means of mesmeric passes, thus establishing contact with the rest of her consciousness during the attack. Our patient proved at first absolutely inaccessible during lethargy. Later, she started to speak spontaneously, was indistractable when her somnambulistic ego was speaking, but distractible when the speaker was one of her automatic personalities. In the latter case, it seems probable that the hypnotic effect of the automatisms succeeded in achieving a partial transformation of the lethargy into hypnosis. When we consider Lowenfeld's view that the lethargic disposition must not be identified outright with the peculiar behavior of the nervous apparatus in hysteria, then the assumption that this disposition was due to family heredity becomes fairly probable. The clinical picture is much more complicated by these attacks. So far, we have seen that the patient's ego consciousness was identical in all states. We have discussed two secondary complexes of consciousness and followed them into the somnambulistic attack, where, owing to the loss of motor expression, they appear to the patient in the second seance as a vision of the two grandfathers. These complexes completely disappeared from view during the attacks that followed, but on the other hand, they developed on and all the more intense activity during the twilight state in the form of visions. It seems that the numerous secondary sequences of ideas must have split off quite early from the primary unconscious personality, for soon after the first two seances, spirits appeared by the dozen. The names were inexhaustible in their variety, but the differences between the various personalities were exhausted very quickly. It became apparent that they could all be classified under two types: the serio religious and the gay hilarious. It was really only a question of two different subconscious personalities appearing under various names, which had, however, no essential significance. The older type, the grandfather, who had started the automatisms off in the first place, was also the first to make use of the twilight state. I cannot remember any suggestion that might have given rise to the automatic speaking. According to our previous explanations, the attack can, in these circumstances, be thought of as a partial self hypnosis. The ego consciousness, which remains over and, as a result of its isolation from the external world, occupies itself entirely with its hallucinations, is all that is left of the waking consciousness. Thus, the automatism has a wide field for its activity. The autonomy of the individual centers, which we found to be present in the patient from the beginning, makes the act of automatic speaking more understandable. Dreamers, too, occasionally talk in their sleep, and people in the waking state sometimes accompany intense thought with unconscious whispering. The peculiar movements of the speech muscles are worth noting. They have been observed in other somnambulists. These clumsy attempts can be directly paralleled by the unintelligent and clumsy movements of the table or glass. In all probability, they correspond to the preliminary expression of the motor components of an idea, or they correspond to an excitation limited to the motor centers and not yet subordinated to a higher system. I do not know whether anything of the sort occurs with people who talk in their dreams, but it has been observed in the hypnotized persons. Since the convenient medium of speech was used as the means of communication, it made the study of these subconscious personalities considerably easier. Their intellectual range was relatively narrow. Their knowledge comprised all that the patient knew in her waking state, plus a few incidental details, such as the birthdays of unknown persons who were dead, etc. The source of this information is rather obscure, since the patient did not know how she could have procured knowledge of these facts in the ordinary way. They were cryptomnesias, but are too insignificant to deserve more detailed mention. The two subconscious personalities had a very meager intelligence. They produced almost nothing but banalities. The interesting thing is the relation to the ego consciousness of the patient in the somnambulistic state. They were well informed about everything that took place during the ecstasies and occasionally gave an exact report, like a running commentary. But they had only a very superficial knowledge of the patient's fantasies. They did not understand them and were unable to answer a single question on this subject correctly. Their stereotyped reply was, "Ask Ivanus." This observation reveals a dualism in the nature of the subconscious personalities, which is rather difficult to explain. For the grandfather, who manifests himself through automatic speech, also appears to Ivanus, and according to her own statement, knew all her thoughts. How is it that when the grandfather speaks through the mouth of the patient, he knows nothing about the very things he teaches Ivanus in the ecstasies? There's a way of looking at this, right? I'm playing around with the exacts, right? But you have four states of the mind, right? There is the conscious mind, which is you making the active decision. There is the unconscious mind and the subconscious mind and the superconscious mind. What it appears to be, especially going through this particular study, right? The subconscious appears to be. I mean, here's the best way. An analogy, right? Think of it as a computer, right? Not even necessarily the no, yes, the computer. Okay, so the superconscious is going to be the actual physicality. It is going to be the earth. It is going to be the resource from which, right? And so it contains the hard drive, it contains the video cards. All of that is the hardware. It is the part that makes the actual thing both a possibility and records what happens, right? It gets written into the hard drive, whatever you do. The second one is going to be the operating system, and that appears to be. It is hard to define whether this is going to be the unconscious or the subconscious. The unconscious is what you do whenever you aren't really thinking about it, whereas the subconscious seems to be the things that underlie that. And so the operating system of the computer is more likely going to be the subconscious. It's going to be like Windows, right? And Windows contains all of the information on the hard drive that you need to be able to interact with it. The unconscious appears to be like the desktop, right? It has all the icons, all of the possibilities that you are able to access, not necessarily that you are accessing, but that you are able to access. And then you have the final element is the consciousness. And the conscious appears to be like the cursor, right? It is the active deciding agent. It is the part that goes on the desktop and makes the decisions. These other entities, right? The grandfather, Evanes, these people appear to be like a apparition in the subconscious. And so that is like when you set up your Windows, the operating system, you can set up different user accounts, right? There is the primary user, the owner of the account, but you can set up one for your children or your spouse or whoever, right? These extra people appear to be those subdivisions in the subconscious, which is the operating system, as opposed to different Windows files that you can click on and access the information freely and easily through your deciding factor, which is the cursor. Uh, and that's really all I had to add to that, right? That is something that I am kicking around for myself, but it appears to be a fairly good analogy for people to understand the four sides of the mind because there are four sides, right? Air, fire, water, and earth are represented by all four of those things. Back to the text. Let us go back to what we said at the first appearance of the hallucinations. paragraph 98, where we describe the vision of the grandfathers as an eruption of hypnosis into the visual sphere. That eruption did not lead to a normal hypnosis, but to hysterio-hypnosis. In other words, the simple hypnosis was complicated by a hysterical attack. It is not a rare occurrence for a normal hypnosis to be disturbed, or rather to be replaced, by the unexpected appearance of hysterical somnambulism. The hypnotist, in many cases, then loses rapport with the patient. In our case, the automatism arising in the motor area plays the part of the hypnotist, and the suggestions emanating from it, objectively described as autosuggestions, hypnotize the neighboring areas which have grown susceptible. But the moment the hypnosis affects the visual sphere, the hysterical attack intervenes, and this, as we have remarked, affects a very profound change over large portions of the psychic area. We must picture the automatism as standing in the same relation to the attack as the hypnotist to a pathological hypnosis. It loses its influence on the subsequent development of the situation. The hallucinatory appearance of the hypnotic personality, or of the suggested idea, may be regarded as the last effect on the personality of the somnambulist. Therefore, the hypnotist becomes a mere figure with whom the somnambulistic personality engages autonomously. He can only just make out what is going on, but can no longer condition the content of the attack. The autonomous ego complex, in this case, Ibonus, now has the upper hand, and she groups her own mental products around the personality of her hypnotist, the grandfather, now diminished to a mere image. In this way, we are able to understand the dualism of the nature of the grandfather. Grandfather 1, who speaks directly to the present, to those present, is a totally different person and a mere spectator of his double, Grandfather 2, who appears as Evanes's teacher. Grandfather 1 maintains energetically that both are the one and the same person, that Grandfather 1 has all the knowledge which Grandfather 2 possesses, and is only prevented from making it public because of language difficulties. The patient herself was naturally not conscious of this split, but took both to be the same person. On closer inspection, however, Grandfather 1 is not altogether wrong, and he can appeal to an observation which apparently confirms the identity of 1 and 2. An example, the fact that they are never both present together. When 1 is speaking automatically, 2 is not present, and Evidence remarks on his absence. Similarly, during her ecstasies when she is with 2, she cannot say where 1 is, or she only learns on returning from her journeys that he has been guarding her body in the meantime. Conversely, the grandfather never speaks when he is going on a journey with Evanes, or when he gives her special illumination. This behavior is certainly remarkable, for if Grandfather 1 is the hypnotist and completely separate from the personality of Evanes, there seems no reason why he should not speak objectively at the same time that his double appears in the ecstasy. Although this might have been supposed possible, as a matter of fact, it was never observed. How is this dilemma to be resolved? Sure enough, there is an identity of 1 and 2, but it does not lie in the realm of the personality under discussion. It lies, rather, in the basis common to both, namely in the personality of the patient, which is in the deepest sense one and indivisible. Here we come upon the characteristic feature of all hysterical splits of consciousness. They are disturbances that only touch the surface, and none of them go so deep as to attack the firmly knit basis of the ego complex. Somewhere, often in an extremely well concealed place, we find the bridge which spans an apparently impassable abyss. For instance, one of the 4 playing cards is made invisible to a hypnotized person by suggestion. Consequently, he calls only the other 3. A pencil is then put into his hand and he is told to write down all the cards before him. He correctly adds the 4th one. Again, a patient of Janet's always saw in the aura of his hysterio-epileptic attacks the vision of a conflagration. Whenever he saw an open fire, he had an attack. Indeed, the sight of a lighted match held before him was sufficient to induce one. The patient's visual field was limited to 30 degrees on the left side. The right eye was closed. The left eye was then focused on the center of a perimeter, while a lighted match was held at 80 degrees. An hysterio epileptic attack took place immediately. Despite extensive amnesia in many cases of double consciousness, the patients do not behave in any way that corresponds to the degree of their ignorance, but as though some obscure instinct still guided their actions in accordance with their former knowledge. Neither this relatively mild amnesiac split, nor even the severe amnesia of the epileptic twilight state, formerly regarded as irreparable damnum, is sufficient to sever the innermost threads that bind the ego complex of the twilight state to that of the normal state. In one case, it was possible to articulate the content of the twilight state with the waking ego complex. If we apply these discoveries to our case, we arrive at the explanatory hypothesis that, under the influence of appropriate suggestions, the layers of the unconscious, which are beyond reach of the split, try to represent the unity of the automatic personality, but that this endeavor comes to grief on the profounder and more elementary disturbance caused by the hysterical attack. This prevents a more complete synthesis by appending associations, which are, as it were, the truest and most original property of the supraconscious personality. The dreams of Evanescence, as it emerges into consciousness, is put into the mouths of the figures who happen to be in the field of vision, and henceforth it remains associated with these persons. We might get all the way through this one. Origin of the unconscious personalities. As we have seen, the various personalities are grouped around two types, the grandfather and Ulrich von Gerenstein. The grandfather produces nothing but sanctimonious twaddle and edifying moral precepts. Ulrich von Gerenstein is simply a silly schoolgirl, with nothing masculine about him except his name. We must here add from the amnesias that the patient was confirmed at the age of 15 by a very pietistic clergyman, and that even at home she had to listen to moral sermons. The grandfather represents this side of her past. Gerbenstein, on the other half, hence the curious contrast. So here we have personified the chief characters of the past. Here, the compulsorily educated bigot. There, the boisterousness of a lively girl of 15 who often goes too far. The patient herself is a peculiar mixture of both, sometimes timid, shy, excessively reserved, at other times boisterous to the point of indecency. She is often painfully conscious of these contrasts. This gives us the key to the origin of the two subconscious personalities. The patient is obviously seeking a middle way between two extremes. She endeavors to repress them and strives for a more ideal state. These strivings lead to the adolescent dream of the ideal Evanescence, besides whom the unrefined aspects of her character fade into the background. They are not lost, but as repressed thoughts, analogous to the idea of Evanescence, they begin to lead an independent existence as autonomous personalities. This behavior caused to mind Freud's dream investigations, which disclosed the independent growth of repressed thoughts. We can now understand why the hallucinatory persons are divorced from those who write and speak automatically. They teach Evanescence the secrets of the beyond. They tell her all those fantastic stories about the extraordinariness of her personality. They create situations in which she can appear dramatically with the attributes of their power, wisdom, and virtue. They are nothing but dramatized split offs from her dream ego. The others, the automata, are the ones to be overcome. They must have no part in Evanescence. The only thing they have in common with her spirit companions is the name. It is not to be expected in a case like this, where no clear cut divisions exist, that two such pregnant groups of characters, with all their idiosyncrasies, should disappear entirely from a somnambulistic ego complex so closely connected with the waking consciousness. And, in fact, we meet them again, partly in those ecstatic penitential scenes and partly in the romances that are crammed with more or less banal, mischievous gossip. On the whole, however, a very much milder form predominates. Course of the disorder. I think we've only got like 8 pages left, so we're going to try and burn through it. It only remains now to say a few words about the course of this singular ailment. The whole process reached its climax within 4 to 8 weeks, and the descriptions of Evanis and the other subconscious personalities refer in general to this period. Thereafter, a gradual decline became noticeable. The ecstasies grew more and more vacuous as Garbenstein's influence increased. The phenomena lost their plasticity and became ever shallower. Characters, which at first were well differentiated, became by degrees inextricably mixed. The psychological yield grew more and more meager until finally the whole story assumed the appearance of a first class fraud. Evanis herself was severely hit by this decline. She became painfully uncertain, spoke cautiously as if feeling her way, so that the character of the patient came through in more and more undisguised form. The somnambulistic attacks, too, decreased in frequency and intensity. One could observe with one's own eyes all the gradations from somnambulism to conscious lying. Thus, the curtain fell. The patient has since gone abroad. The fact that her character has become pleasanter and more stable may have a significance that is not to be underestimated. If we remember those cases where the second state gradually came to replace the first, we may be dealing here with a similar phenomenon. It is well known that somnambulistic symptoms are particularly common in puberty. The attacks of somnambulism in Dice's case began immediately before the onset of puberty and lasted just till its end. The somnambulism of Helene Smith is likewise closely connected with puberty. Schroeder Vanderkolk's patient was 16 at the time of her illness. Lydia, X, 14 and a half. We know that the future character is formed and fixed at this period. We saw in the cases of Lydia X and Mary Reynolds how the character of the second state gradually replaced that of the first. It is therefore conceivable that the phenomena of double consciousness are simply new character formations, or attempts of the future personality to break through, and that in consequence of special difficulties, unfavorable circumstances, psychopathic dispositions of the nervous system, etc., they get bound up with peculiar disturbances of consciousness. In view of the difficulties that oppose the future character, the somnambulisms sometimes have an eminently teleological significance in that they give the individual, who would otherwise inevitably succumb, the means of victory. Here I am thinking, and like all that is really, right? All of this that it has been described can be completely taken as a form of therapy, right? Even talk therapy, when she is in her somnambulistic state, expressing unexpressed wants and desires in a way that allows her to actually come to terms with that they are something that she wants. And so she can change her life in the way that she wants to go. It's quite an unconventional therapy system, but it seems to have worked. So here I am thinking especially of Joan of Arc, whose extraordinary courage reminds one of the feats performed by Mary Reynolds in her second state. This is also, perhaps, the place to point out the like significance of teleological hallucinations, of which occasional cases come to the knowledge of the public, although they have not yet been subjected to scientific study. Heightened unconscious performance. We have now discussed all the essential phenomena presented by our case, which were significant for its inner structure. Certain accompanying phenomena have still to be briefly considered. These are the phenomena of heightened unconscious performance. In this field, we meet with a not altogether unjustifiable skepticism on the part of scientific pundits. Even the Suave's conception of the second ego aroused considerable opposition and was rejected in many quarters as too enthusiastic. As we know, occultism has claimed a special right in this field, and has drawn premature conclusions from dubious observations. We are still very far indeed from being able to say anything conclusive, for up to the present our material is nothing like adequate. If therefore we touch on this question of heightened unconscious performance, we do so only to do justice to all sides of our case. By heightened unconscious performance, we mean that peculiar automatic process whose results are not available for the conscious psychic activity of the individual. Under this category comes, first of all, thought reading by means of table movements. I do not know whether there are people who can guess an entire long train of thought by means of inductive inferences from the intended tremors. At any rate, it is certain that, granting this to be possible, such persons must be making use of a routine acquired by endless practice. But in our case, routine can be ruled out at once, and there is no choice but to assume, for the present, a receptivity of the unconscious far exceeding that of the conscious mind. This is where he starts ruminating about the collective unconscious. That gets written in the superconscious, if you were wondering. This assumption is supported by numerous observations on somnambulists. Here, I will mention only Benet's experiments, where little letters or other small objects or complicated little figures in relief were laid on the anesthetic skin of the back of the hand or the neck, and the unconscious perceptions were registered by means of signs. On the basis of these experiments, he comes to the following conclusion. According to the calculations that I have been able to make, the unconscious sensibility of an hysterical patient is at certain moments 50 times more acute than that of a normal person. Another example of heightened performance that applies to our case and to numerous other somnambulists is the process known as cryptomnesia. By this is meant the coming into consciousness of a memory image which is not recognized as such in the first instance, but only secondarily, if at all, by means of subsequent recollection or abstract reasoning. It is characteristic of cryptomnesia that the image which comes up does not bear the distinctive marks of the memory image. That is to say, it is not connected with the supraliminal ego complex in question. There are three different ways in which the cryptomnesic image may be brought into consciousness. One, the image enters consciousness without the mediation of the senses, intrapsychically. This is a sudden idea, or hunch, whose causal nexus is hidden from the person concerned. To this extent, cryptomnesia is an everyday occurrence and is intimately bound up with normal psychic processes. But how often it misleads the scientist, author, or composer into believing that his ideas are original, and then along comes a critic and points out the source. Generally, the individual formulation of the idea protects the author from the charge of plagiarism and proves his good faith, though there are cases where the reproduction occurs unconsciously, almost word for word. Should the passage contain a remarkable idea, then the suspicion of more or less conscious plagiarism is justified. After all, an important idea is linked by numerous associations to the ego complex. It has been thought about at different times and in different situations, and therefore has innumerable connecting threads leading in all directions. Consequently, it can never disappear so entirely from consciousness that its continuity is lost to the sphere of conscious memory. We have, however, a criterion by which we can always recognize intrapsychic cryptomnesia objectively. The cryptomnesic idea is linked to the ego complex by the minimum of associations. The reason for this lies in the relation of the individual to the object concerned, in the want of proportion between interest and object. Two possibilities are conceivable. A. The object is worthy of interest, but the interest is slight, owing to distractibility or lack of understanding. B. The object is not worthy of interest. Consequently, the interest is slight. In both cases, there is an extremely labile connection with consciousness, the result being that the object is quickly forgotten. This flimsy bridge soon breaks down and the idea sinks into the unconscious, where it is no longer accessible to the conscious mind. Should it now re enter consciousness by way of cryptomnesia, The feeling of strangeness of its being an original creation will cling to it because the path by which it entered the subconscious can no longer be discovered. Strangeness and original creation are, moreover, closely allied to one another, and if we remember the numerous witnesses in Belles Lettres to the possessed nature of genius, apart from a number of striking instances of this kind, where it is doubtful whether it is cryptomnesia or an original creation, there are others where a passage of no essential value has been reduced cryptomnesiacally, and in almost the same words as in the following example. Nietzsche, thus spoke Zarathustra. Now, about the time that Zarathustra sojourned on the Happy Isles, it happened that a ship anchored at the isle on which the smoking mountain stands, and the crew went ashore to shoot rabbits. At about noontide hour, however, when the captain and his men were together again, they suddenly saw a man coming towards them through the air, and a voice said distinctly, "It is time. It is highest time." But when the figure drew close to them, flying past quickly like a shadow in the direction of the volcano, they recognized with the greatest dismay that it was Zarathustra. "Behold," said the old helmsman, "Zarathustra goes down to hell." We have read through the entirety of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. If you are interested, there is a playlist. Kerner, Blatter aus Provorst. The four captains and a merchant, Mr. Bell, went ashore on the island of Mount Stromboli to shoot rabbits. At 3 o'clock, they mustered the crew to go aboard, when, to their inexpressible astonishment, they saw two men flying rapidly towards them through the air. One was dressed in black, the other in gray. They came past them very closely, in the greatest haste, and, to their utmost dismay, descended amidst the burning flames into the crater of the terrible volcano, Mount Stromboli. They recognized the pair as acquaintances from London. Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, told me, in reply to my inquiry, that Nietzsche had taken a lively interest in Kerner when staying with his grandfather, Pastor Yoler, in Pobler, between the ages of 12 and 15, but certainly not later. It could scarcely have been Nietzsche's intention to commit a plagiarism from a ship's log. Had this been the case, he would surely have omitted that extremely prosaic and totally irrelevant passage about shooting rabbits. Obviously, when painting the picture of Zarathustra's descent into hell, that forgotten impression from his youth must have slipped half or wholly unconsciously into his mind. This example shows all the peculiarities of cryptomnesia, a quite unimportant detail which only deserves to be forgotten as quickly as possible, is suddenly reproduced with almost literal fidelity, while the main point of the story is, one cannot say modified, but recreated in an individual manner. Around the individual core, the idea of the journey to hell, there are deposited, as picturesque details, those old, forgotten impressions of a similar situation. The story itself is so absurd that the young Nietzsche, a voracious reader, probably skimmed through it without evincing any very profound interest in the matter. Here, then, is the required minimum of associative connections, for we can hardly conceive of a greater jump than from that stupid old tale to Nietzsche's consciousness in the year 1883. If we realize Nietzsche's state of mind at the time when he wrote Zarathustra, and the poetic ecstasy that at more than one point verges on the pathological, this abnormal reminiscence will appear more understandable. Yeah, Nietzsche was completely unhinged. Like completely unhinged. The other of the two possibilities mentioned above, namely registering some object, not in itself uninteresting, in a state of distractibility or partial interest due to lack of understanding, and its cryptomnesiac reproduction, is found mainly in Somnambulists, and also, as curiosities of literature, in people at the point of death. Out of the rich choice of these phenomena, we are chiefly concerned here with speaking in foreign tongues, the symptom of glossolalia. This phenomenon is mentioned in practically all cases of ecstasy. It is found in the New Testament, in the Acta Sanctorum, in the witch trials, and in recent times in the story of the clairvoyant of Prevorst. in Judge Edmund's daughter, Laura, and Flournoy's Helene Smith, who was thoroughly investigated on this question too, and also in Bressler's case, which is probably identical with that of Blumhardt's Gottliebien Dittes. As Flournoy has shown, glossolalia, insofar as it is really independent language, is a cryptomnesiac phenomenon par excellence. I would refer the reader to Flournoy's exceedingly interesting study of the subject. In our case, glossolalia was observed only once, and then the only intelligible words were interspersed variations of the word vena. The origin of this word is clear. A few days previously, the patient had dipped into an anatomical atlas and immersed herself in a study of the veins of the face, which were given in Latin, and she used the word vena in her dreams, just as a normal person might do. The remaining words and sentences in foreign language reveal at a glance their derivation from the patient's slight knowledge of French. Unfortunately, I did not get exact translations of the various sentences because the patient refused to give them to me. But we can take it that it was the same sort of thing as Helene Smith's Martian language. Flournoy shows that this Martian language is nothing but a childish translation from the French. Only the words were altered, the syntax remained the same. A more probable explanation is that our patient simply strung a lot of meaningless foreign sounding words together, and instead of forming any true words, borrowed certain characteristic sounds from French and Italian and combined them into a sort of language, just as Helene Smith filled in the gaps between the real Sanskrit words with pseudo-linguistic products of her own. The curious names of the mystical system can mostly be traced back to its known roots. Even the circles remind one of the planetary orbits found in every school atlas. The inner parallel with the relation of the planets to the sun is also pretty clear, so we shall not go far wrong if we see the names as reminiscences of popular astronomy. In this way, we see the names Perseus, Venus, Ninus, Serum, Surus, Fixus, and Pix can be explained as childish distortions of Perseus, Venus, Sirius, and fixed star, analogous to the Venus variations. Magnosaur is reminiscent of magnetism, whose mystical significance the patient knew from the clairvoyance of Provost's story. Conessor, being contrary to magnesaur, the first syllable con suggests French contre. Hypsos and hypnotism remind one of hypnosis and hypnotism, about which the weirdest ideas still circulate amongst laymen. The frequent endings in us and os are the signs by which people distinguish between Latin and Greek. The other names derive from similar accidents, which we lack the clues. Naturally, the modest glossolalia of our case cannot claim to be a classic example of cryptomnesia, for it consists only in the unconscious use of different impressions, some optical, some acoustic, and all very obvious. 2. The cryptomnesiac image enters consciousness through mediation of the senses as a hallucination. Helene Smith is the classic example of this. See the case cited above concerning the number 18. 3. The image enters consciousness by motor automatism. Helene Smith had lost a very valuable brooch while she was anxiously looking for everywhere. 10 days later, her guide, Leopold, told her by table movements where it was. From the information received, she found it one night in the open field, covered by sand. Strictly speaking, in cryptomnesia, there is no heightened performance in the true sense of the term, since the conscious memory experiences no intensification of function, but only an enrichment of content. Through the automatism, certain areas which were previously closed to consciousness are made accessible to it in an indirect way, but the unconscious itself is not performing any function that exceeds the capacities of the conscious mind, either qualitatively or quantitatively. Cryptomnesia is therefore only an apparent instance of a heightened performance in contrast to hypermnesia, where there is an actual increase of function. I guess I was wrong about the page count. Right. We spoke earlier of the unconscious mind having a receptivity superior to that of the conscious mind, chiefly in regard to simple thought transference experiments with numbers. As already mentioned, not only are somnambulists, but a fairly large number of normal people are able to guess from tremor movements quite long trains of thought, provided they are not too complicated. These experiments are, so to speak, the prototype of those rarer and incomparably more astonishing cases of intuitive knowledge displayed at times by somnambulists. Jacques has shown from his own self analysis that such phenomena occur in connection not only with somnambulism, but with non somnambulists as well. This knowledge seems to have been formed in several different ways. The first thing to be considered, as we have said, is the delicacy of unconscious perceptions. Secondly, we must emphasize the importance of what proves to be the enormous suggestibility of somnambulists. The somnambulist not only incorporates every suggestive idea into himself, he actually lives himself into the suggestion, into the person of the doctor or observer, with the utter abandoned characteristic of suggestible hysterics. Frau Hof's relation to Kerner is an excellent example of this. So, it is not surprising that there is, in these cases, a high degree of concordative associations, a fact which Richet, for instance, might have taken more in account of in his experiments on thought transference. Finally, there are cases of somnambulistic heightened performance which cannot be explained solely by the hyperesthetic unconscious activity of the senses or by the concord of associations, but which postulate a highly developed intellectual activity of the unconscious. To decipher the intended tremor movements requires an extraordinary delicacy of feeling, both sensitive and sensory, in order to combine the individual perceptions into a self contained unit of thought. If indeed it is permissible at all to make an analogy between the cognitive processes in the unconscious and those of the conscious, the possibility must always be borne in mind that, in the unconscious, feelings and concepts are not so clearly separated and may even be one. The intellectual exaltation which many somnambulists display during ecstasy, though rather uncommon, is a well observed fact, and I am inclined to regard the mystical system devised by our patient as just such an example of heightened unconscious performance that transcends our normal intelligence. We have already seen where part of that system probably comes from. Another source may be Frau Hof's life circles, depicted in Kerner's book. At any rate, its outward form seems to be determined by these factors, as we have already noted. The idea of dualism derives from those fragments of conversations overheard by the patient in the dreamy state following her ecstasies. Now, I don't know how long the conclusion is, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. My dogs are ringing the bell. They need to go out. So hopefully, I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult series of topics. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. I don't have a whole lot to add to this, right? We discussed everything we really needed to as we went along. And for the most part, I didn't have a whole lot to add because it is a case history and it is a discussion of that. And I only key in when I have something relevant. So if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, a follow, throw me a comment, whether you agree or disagree with anything. Put it in the box, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you truly found value, hit me with the super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of one of my books, or reaching out to me through the links provided down below. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been pittstake. Peace.